Hey everyone, welcome to lecture 13 of CSE 4635. In this lecture, we will be starting our talk on JavaScript, and we will be taking a look at intro, history, the different data types that are available in JavaScript, template literals, conditions, and functions. So a lot of things to cover, so let's get started. So let's start with some of the very basics of JavaScript. JavaScript is a high-level language. What that means is that we don't have to worry about stuff like memory management and so on. Those are all automatically handled by JavaScript itself. Next, JavaScript is object-oriented. So whichever concepts that we're familiar with when it comes to object-oriented programming, those same concepts will be applied to JavaScript as well. We can use JavaScript for both front-end as well as back-end development when it comes to web applications. So for front-end development, we have different frameworks like Angular, React, and so on, which can be used for essentially designing beautiful front-end pages. On the other hand, if we are interested in back-end development, we have other frameworks as well, notably Node.js. Now you need to remember that it is not essential for you to use any specific framework for designing the front end of a web application using JavaScript. Without using frameworks like Angular or React, you can also use the core JS language itself to essentially develop your front end pages. JavaScript basically allows us to add dynamic and interactive content to web pages. So for example, whenever you see a loading screen, or you see something being loaded from another page to one page from one page to another, you can understand from by looking at those that JavaScript is being used there as well. One of the major advantages of JavaScript is that it supports both C++ and Java syntax. So since you guys are already familiar with both C++ and Java syntax, it will be very easy for you to actually accustom yourselves to the syntax of JavaScript as well. JavaScript has a special feature called dynamic typing. Now, what we mean by dynamic typing is something that we will be taking a look at one of the future slides. All right. So for now, just remember that dynamic typing means that JavaScript variables do not have any specific type. Rather, whenever we assign any value to a variable in JavaScript, only then the variable is assigned a type. Finally, what you need to remember is JavaScript is not compiled, rather it is interpreted. So what that means is, so far whenever it comes to Java or C++ language, we usually have a compiler which takes our code, converts that code into bytecode that can be understood by our machine, and then our machine can actually run that program. But in case of JavaScript, it does not rely on any compiler, but it relies on an interpreter. And this interpreter is embedded in almost all the modern web browsers that we have today, like Chrome, Firefox, and so on. So our web browsers are responsible for interpreting these JavaScript programs and basically rendering them and showing them in our web pages. So now that we understand the core concept behind JavaScript and how it works, so we might be asking ourselves, what is the role of JavaScript? So the role of JavaScript, as you can already understand, is both present in the front end and back end side. But for now, let's focus on the front end. So whenever we think of the front end of a web application, we understand web pages, right? Now, in case of web pages, we can already understand that there are three core technologies that work behind web pages. So one of the technologies is HTML, the other is CSS, and finally, the third is JavaScript, or JS for short. Now, when we talk about HTML, we can say that HTML is the main information or the main message that we want to display to our users whenever they view the web page, okay? In case of CSS, we can say that CSS is basically a style sheet that describes how that information in our HTML page is going to be displayed to the user. And finally, when it comes to JS gives us the ability to control how we want to, or what exactly we want to do with the information that is present in our HTML web pages. So if we were to compare these three technologies to the parts of speech of English language, then we can say that HTML is the noun, CSS is the adjective, and JS or JavaScript is the verb. So obviously by noun we mean the messages or the information that is present in our HTML pages. So for example, we have some text like this, which is inside this paragraph tag, right? Now suppose we want this paragraph text or this some text to be displayed in the red color. So we can define that by using CSS color tag, right? And finally, suppose we want to actually decide whether we want to show this paragraph or not to the client, right? So we can do that by using JavaScript's p.hide function. So this is a very basic idea of what role JavaScript plays when it comes to the front-end side. So hopefully you were able to understand the basic concept behind JavaScript, that is how it works, and at the same time you get a general idea of the role of JavaScript when it comes to front-end development. Now let's take a look at some of the historical aspects as well as some facts about JavaScript. JavaScript was first invented or written in 1995 by Brendan Eich when he was hired by Netscape to create something or to create a language that would introduce the concept of dynamic interaction in web pages. So Brendan Eich developed the first version of JavaScript in just 10 days and called it Mocha. In 1996, Mocha was named to LiveScript and then it was renamed to JavaScript. It was renamed to JavaScript solely for the purpose of attracting Java developers, and since Java language was the most popular language back in those times. So after that, Microsoft launched Internet Explorer, which basically copied JavaScript from Netscape and named it to JScript for legal reasons, obviously. Now, since so many languages were coming up that are following JavaScript, but were not following any specific standard, people realized that a standard was necessary, right? So in 1997, ECMA or ECMA released ECMAScript 1 or ES1, which was the first official standard for JavaScript. Now remember, ECMAScript 1 is the standard and JavaScript is a language that follows that standard. In 2009, ES5 or ECMAScript 5 was released, which was a very big update to the JavaScript language, and it contained a lot of new features. Now remember, when JavaScript was released way back in 1995, it already contained some of the very interesting or some of the core features that we still use today. Alright, so in 2015, ES6 or ES 2015 was released. This was the single biggest ever update to the language, and it contained a lot of core functionalities and a lot of core features that are used in all modern web development today. Now, after 2015, ES shifted to an annual release cycle so that they did not have to deal with the hassle of shipping more features with each update. So since they are releasing different versions of JavaScript annually, they can ship fewer features per update. So after this, we have had different releases of ES in 2016, 2017, 2018, and so on. Now, one of the major fact of JavaScript is that it is backwards compatible. Now, when we say backwards compatible, what do we mean? So suppose a web page was developed back in 2005, and right now we are in 2020, right? So if we were to visit that web page that was developed in 2005 and our web browser did not have the engine to render the JavaScript that was written in 2005, then we would not be able to view that web page, right? So the main purpose behind backwards compatibility is to not break the web, okay? To make sure that all the modern JavaScript code that we write today is supported by all browsers, some techniques called transpiling and polyfilling are used. So the reason behind this is that we cannot always assume that all the browsers will support all the modern JavaScript code that we write. It is entirely possible that some users may have some outdated browser or not the latest browser, which do not support the cutting edge technologies that are used by JavaScript today. So to avoid that, we use some techniques called transpiling and polyfilling. So a tool called Babel is used to transpile modern JavaScript code back to ES5. Now ES5 is assumed to be the most used JavaScript version that is compatible with all the web browsers today. So ES5, any JavaScript written in ES5 is compatible up to 2011's Internet Explorer version 9. And so it is kind of become a good practice to convert all your JS code back to ES5 by using a tool called Babel, and to basically transpile your modern JS code. So since we understand that from 2016, from 2015, ES6 has been released, we say that whenever we deal with modern JS, we are working with ES6 Plus, because it will be a hassle to call ES6 Plus, ES 2016, ES 2017 every year, right? So instead of that, what we do is we say that whenever we are working with modern JavaScript, we are basically working with ES6 Plus. There are some very interesting topics to be read, like which features are compatible, or which modern JavaScript features are compatible with which browser. And if you are interested in reading those things, you can visit the following link. All right, now let's talk about the different kinds of data types that are available in JavaScript. Now, earlier, we said that JavaScript has a special feature called dynamic typing. Now, when it comes to languages like C++ or Java, what happens is whenever we want to declare any variables, we declare the variable type as well. So for example, if we want to create an integer variable, we write something like int sample variable is equal to something, right? In case of JavaScript, such a thing does not exist. That is because the variables in JavaScript do not have any type. They are only assigned a type whenever we assign a value to that variable. So ultimately what that means is the values have data types, but the variables themselves do not have any specific data type. All right. Now, since JavaScript is an object-oriented language, it has two basic categories of data types. Your variables can be either the object type, or it can be of the primitive type. Now, when it comes to the primitive type, there are 7 data types in JavaScript. These are number, string, boolean, undefined, null, symbol, and big int. Let's take a look at each of them in a bit more detail. So the number data type is any kind of floating point number, and it can be up to the limit 2 to the power 53 minus 1. Okay. Now, in case of languages like C++ and Java, we have a distinction between floating point numbers, integers, and so on, right? However, such is not the case when it comes to JavaScript. All numbers are floating point numbers. So even if you create a variable like this, let test number is equal to 5, this 5 is going to be stored as 5.0, okay? Next data type we have is string, and a string is very simple. We have a string as a sequence of characters, and to create a string variable, you can write something like this: let test string is equal to us. Now, do not worry about the syntax for now. Just know that this let keyword is used to create a variable. Next, we have the Boolean type, and as you can guess, the Boolean types can hold either true or false. So to create a Boolean variable, we simply write let test Boolean is equal to true. When it comes to undefined, an undefined variable is a variable that has not been assigned any value. So for example, we can write something like this, and it is going to be completely legal. The only difference between this test undefined variable and the rest of these 3 variables is that these 3 variables have been assigned a specific type based on the value that they have been assigned. However, since this test undefined variable has not been assigned any value, this test undefined variable is said to be of the undefined type. Next, we have the null value, which is pretty self-explanatory. We have the symbol type, which basically denotes a unique value that cannot be changed. Now this value or this data type was introduced in ES 2015, and the use case for this variable really depends on what kind of application you're writing. Next, we have the big int data type, and the big int data type essentially denotes all the numbers that cannot be bigger than 2 to the power 53 minus 1. That is, all the numbers that are bigger than the number data type can support. So these are the main primitive data types that JavaScript has. And now that we have a basic idea of the theoretical aspects of JavaScript, we can finally get into the language itself. So let's get into it. All right, so we have talked about earlier how JavaScript is not compiled, but rather interpreted. Now, these interpreters are usually embedded in all the modern web browsers that we use today. So when we work with languages like Java or C++, we usually type our code inside an IDE, and that IDE compiles that code into bytecode, which is then understood by our machine and can be run on our machine. In case of JavaScript, all we have to do is we simply have to write our JavaScript code inside a .js file, and if we render that .js file using our web browser, we will be able to see whatever it is that we are trying to display, or whatever it is that we are trying to do. So for our example here and for our use case here, what we will be doing is we will be using the IntelliJ IDE to write our code, and we will be using the Chrome browser to actually render our JavaScript code. Now, in this screen, you can see that on the left-hand side, I have opened up my IntelliJ, and on the right-hand side, I have opened up my Chrome browser. And for this example, we have a simple index.html file that simply prints this JavaScript Basics message at the center of the page. Now, you might be wondering, when it comes to C++ or Java or any other language, we usually have a console, right? And we usually print things on that console. For example, in case of Java, we write system.out.print to print something on the console. And in case of C++, we write cout to print something on the console. So how does that console work when it comes to JavaScript? Well, the answer is very simple. That console is present in every modern web browser. So when it comes to Chrome, if you want to bring up that console, all you have to do is you simply have to go to your more tools, then developer tools, and here you can see that you have an option called console. This console, this console is basically what it is that you're looking for here. Okay, so if you want, you can position this tab or this whole window pane according to your liking. For example, you can keep it like this or however you want. So for this tutorial, this is the layout that we will be following. There are some other tabs as well, like elements, sources, network performance, but we're not interested in those. We will only be taking a look at the console. Now, the equivalent of system.out.print that is available in Java, the equivalent of that function in JavaScript is called console.log. So we use this console.log function to print anything on our console. So for example, if we want to print a message called this is a simple message, for example, and we hit enter, as you can see, this message has been printed on our console, right? So it is possible to actually write JS code or JavaScript code inside this console as well. All right, so now that we understand the very basics and on how to get started, let's actually get into coding. So you might be wondering now how we can incorporate JavaScript code with our with our HTML pages. Well, there are two basic ways. One is by using inline JavaScript, and the other is by linking to an external JavaScript file. So suppose you want to incorporate some JavaScript code inside your HTML page from your HTML page. So for that, all you have to do is you have to use the script tag, and inside this script tag, you have to write your JavaScript code. So for example, for this example, I will be using the alert function to simply print a message called this is an alert box using inline JavaScript. So calling this function is simply going to create an alert box in this page whenever we refresh it the next time, and that alert box is going to print this as an alert box using inline JavaScript. So let's see if that happens. All right, so we refreshed the page, and as you can see, we are getting an alert box that is saying this is an alert box using inline JavaScript. Now, in most cases, you would not want to incorporate JavaScript code directly inside your HTML pages like this, because you would want to separate your actual information that is present in the HTML page from the presentation logic that is present in your JavaScript file. So essentially, the concept of separation of concerns comes here again, right? So to avoid this incorporation of both JavaScript logic as well as HTML body inside your same file, what developers would do is they will usually create a separate script file or a separate .js file and link that .js file to the required HTML page. So for that, you again have to use the script code or the script tag, sorry. And all you have to do is define the source of the script by using the src attribute and type the script that you want to point to. Now, in this example, I have already created a sample script.js file, so I will be linking to that file here. Now, remember, whenever you have the HTML page and the .js file in the same directory, you do not have to specify the whole path to that JS file. You can simply write the name of the JS file and it will work. However, if they are in separate folders, then you will have to mention the whole path to that JS file. All right. So if you remember, our index page, that is our static resources, are located under the web app directory whenever it comes to Java-based web applications. So here you can see that I have an index.html page, and I have already created a script.js file. So if you want to create any new script file or any new JavaScript file, you simply have to click this option here, and it will give you the option to create a JavaScript file with any name that you want. All right. So since we have already created a script.js file, let's go into that file and see what we can do. All right. So I have written down some comments here so that we can navigate through these comments and see the various functionalities that we will be seeing by using JavaScript code. So first, what we will be seeing is we will be printing that same alert box that we just did by using the inline JavaScript function. But now what we will be doing is we will be essentially doing the same thing by using our external script.js file here. So give me a moment. So let's write alert, and we will simply print the message. This is an alert box using external JS file. And now we go back to our index page. We can see that we do not have that inline JS code anymore, but we do have this line of code here where we are linking to our script.js file. So when we run this code, we should be able to see the message, or should be able to see the alert box that says this is an alert box using external JS file. So let's do that. And yeah, as you can see, this is an alert box using external JS file. So we can understand that this is how you can link any external JS file to your index.html or to any HTML page, basically. When it comes to JavaScript comments, the syntax is essentially similar to what you're familiar with in Java or C++. So if you want to write a single line comment, you simply use the // like this. And if you want to write a multi-line comment or a comment block, then you use /*, write down your comment, and then end with */. All right. Next, let's take a look at how you can declare variables in JavaScript. So prior to ES6, the keyword var was used to declare variables. So for example, if you want to declare a variable called a and assign it the value of 20, you would write something like this. But after ES6, or that is during in ES6, a new keyword was introduced called let. And this let keyword is basically used to declare variables now. So what you need to remember is var can still be used when it comes to the modern JavaScript, that is ES6+. However, it is a good practice to avoid writing var and instead use let to create variables. You need to remember from this that let is block scoped, whereas var is function scoped. We will understand more in detail about these things when we actually study function and block in JavaScript. For now, just remember that you should avoid var and you should use let instead. Another keyword that is used to declare variables in JavaScript is called const. And as you can already understand, this const keyword can be used to declare constants like this. So unlike var or let, any variable that you declare by using the const keyword, they cannot be changed. That is, you cannot change the value of C from 20 to something else. Something else you need to remember is it is possible to create undefined variables by using the let or var keyword. So for example, you can create something like this. However, if you want to create a constant variable, you always have to assign it a value. Otherwise, it will give you some kind of error. So for example, if you write something like this, then you can see that it is giving us an error, right? Const variable without initializers is not allowed. So anyway, that is how you can declare variables in JavaScript. Now, we already know of the different kinds of primitive data types that are available in JavaScript, right? So suppose we want to create a number type variable. So all we have to do for that is write something like this. Suppose I am creating a variable called test number, and I am assigning it the value 5. Similarly, if I want to create a string, all I have to do is do something like this. But you need to remember, in case of JavaScript, you don't have to use just double quotes to create string type variables. If you want, you can also use single quotations like this. Okay. Next, we have the Boolean type variable. So for that, we can also do something like this. And finally, for undefined variables, we can do something like this. So all of this are completely fine and completely legal when it comes to variables in JavaScript. Now, there is a special operator called the typeof operator, which can be used to understand the kind of or to basically understand the type of a variable in JavaScript. So for example, here I can write something like this, console.log, and here I can write typeof, and I can check the type of the variables that I have just declared. So test number, and let me just copy paste this a couple of times. Test boolean, test string, and test undefined. Now when I run this JavaScript code, then in my console here, I should see the type of each of these variables. Okay, so let's try and run this. So this is the alert box that we had created earlier. And here you can see that we have the 4 different kinds of types that we have declared for our variables. So as you can see, test number is the number type, test boolean is the boolean type, test string is the string type, and test undefined is undefined type. So we can essentially use this typeof operator to understand the type of a variable that we are using. If we want, we can also do something like this. We can write something like typeof 25, and it will still print number, right? Another thing, when it comes to JavaScript, you don't really need to use semicolon to end your statements. You can simply erase this semicolons, and your code will run just fine as well. But it's a good coding practice to basically use semicolons for each of your lines because it helps in clean coding. Okay, so for now, let's comment out this alert box so we don't get that alert box each time we refresh this page. All right. Next, we will be taking a look at the different kinds of operators that are available in JavaScript. So when it comes to mathematical operators, we have plus, minus, division, multiplication, and exponentiation. when it comes to comparison operators, we have less than, greater than, less than or equal, greater than or equal, and equal equal. We also have our logical operators like and, or, not, and so on. Okay. So basically, whatever operators we have seen being used in languages like C++ or Java, those same operators can be used in JavaScript as well. However, there are a couple of differences between the operators used in those languages and in JavaScript, which we will be taking a look at later. Now we will be talking about strings and template literals. When it comes to strings in JavaScript, there are multiple ways you can manipulate strings. So the ways that we are familiar with, for example, in Java, we can use the plus operator to concatenate two strings. So something similar can be done in JavaScript as well. So for example, I can write something like this. Let last name is equal to Jawad. Let full name is equal to first name plus a space between them plus last name. And when we print this on our console, let's see what we get. As you can see, we get the whole Anas Jawad in a single string. So yeah, you basically understand that string manipulation is kind of similar to other languages in JavaScript. Now, what is special in JavaScript is a feature called template literal. Now, normally we either use single quote or double quotation marks to declare strings in JavaScript. In case of template literal, we do something else. So for example, suppose I am creating a sample string, but instead of using quotation marks, I will be using the backtick operator. So the backtick operator can be found at the top of the, or above the tab button on your keyboard. So using this backtick operator, we can define a template literal in JavaScript. So there are many advantages when it comes to template literals like this. So for example, in case of concatenation, when we use normal strings, we have to do something like this, right? We have to write down the first string first, then we have to insert some kind of space or something. This could be a space, or this could even be a forward \n operator to input new line, and so on, right? So you understand, it introduces a kind of a complexity when it comes to concatenation or some other kinds of string manipulation. So the advantage to using template literals is that you don't have to go through all those troubles to concatenate or to insert new lines in your strings. All you have to do is something like this. So for example, I want to mention that let's name this as sample message, okay, just for clarity. And suppose I want to print this message here. My name is Anas Jawad. Now suppose I only have the first name and the last name here. Now if we were using strings instead of template literals, we would have done something like this, right? We have used the plus operator, and then we would have added the first name and last name, right? Now, in case of template literal, we don't have to do that. We can simply do something like this. We can use the $curly braces sign, and here we can write first name and space. We can use our second, that is our last name, in the same way as well, like this. And when we actually print this sample message, let's see what we get. So yeah, as you can see, our whole string has been concatenated without having to do something like stop the string operator there, then use another quotation to add space between them, and then again concatenate some other string. We did not really have to go through all that trouble. At the same time, if we have to do something like insert a space, or sorry, insert a new line in our new string, we can do that as well. How? We simply have to do something like this. We just hit enter, we basically hit enter between our two lines, and automatically our string will be designed according to that as well. So as you can see, we did not really have to use the \n operator. So in case of normal strings, we would have had to do something like this, right? We would have had to write \n to basically denote that we want to insert a new line between our strings. But in case of template literals, we can simply hit enter, and automatically our string will have a new line between them. Now, this is actually really helpful when we use JavaScript to actually dynamically generate HTML code. So suppose I am using this JavaScript code to actually generate my HTML document. Now, obviously, HTML document is going to have multiple number of lines. So instead of having to write something like \n for each of those lines, I can simply do something like this, where I hit enter and automatically a new line is going to be inserted in my string. So this is just some of the very basic things that you can do with strings. There are obviously a lot of other things as well, but we are not going to get too in depth of those things. Next, we have type conversion. So we already know that there are different types of variables when it comes to JavaScript. So for example, when I do something like this, sample string is equal to 20. So what exactly is the data type for this string, for this variable? Well, since we have used double quotation for defining the value of this variable, we can say that even though it says 20, the value of this, the data type of this variable is going to be string, right? Now, in JavaScript, it is possible to convert values like this from one variable type, that is from one data type, to another. So, for example, I can do something like this. And what this will do is this 20, that is this 20 string, is going to be converted to 20 number. So this is similar to using the the integer.parseInt function that is present in Java. So we are essentially converting this string into a number by using this number function. Similarly, we can also convert this string, this number, back to a string by using the string function. Okay, so let's try to take a look at the type of this variables each time they are being converted from one data type to another. So this line here should give us the answer number, and if we print it again here, then this line should give us the answer string. Okay, so let's comment these lines out for now. Let's refresh this page, and as you can see, this first console.log line gives us the value of the data type of this sample string as number, because we had used the number function to convert it to a number. Okay, next, again, we had converted this sample string variable from number to string by using the string function, and so when we printed the type of that sample string variable, we got the answer as string. Okay, so these types of type conversions are actually very common in JavaScript, and they are very useful when we are writing any program. Now, there is another feature in JavaScript which we call type coercion. So type coercion is basically the fact that sometimes JavaScript implicitly converts the data type of a variable from one type to another. So as for an example, let me just comment these things out before I move on. Okay, so as for example, suppose I have a variable like this. So I have a number type variable here since I have assigned it the value 20. Now, what do you think will happen if I write something like this? So not 20, let's write 10. So here you can see that I have written xyz is equal to xyz minus the string 10. So in this case, what will happen is JavaScript will implicitly convert this 10 string into 10 number and then subtract it from the value of xyz, because xyz is a number itself. So now when I type console.log and print the value of xyz, you see I get the value 10, right? So another thing that you should remember is whenever the variable value is in a color like this, for example, in this case it is purple color. So whenever it is a purple color like this in the console, just remember that it is denoting a number. Okay. Anyway, now suppose I am doing something like this: xyz is equal to xyz plus, sorry, plus suppose 5. Okay, so now what do you think will happen? Well, in this case, what happens is JavaScript will not convert this 5 string into a 5 number. Instead, since we are using the plus operator between these two values, this 5 will be kept as a string, and it will be concatenated to xyz here. Okay, so if we do this and print the value of xyz again, then you see that we get 105. Now, another thing to notice here is that since 105 is in white color, we can understand that this is a string. Okay, so that's just how this console is displaying things. Next, there are some other interesting things as well. So to actually denote or to actually show you that when I print the value of xyz here, it is a number, and when I print the value of xyz here, it is a string. Let's use the typeof operator again. So, sorry, let's write typeof here, and let's write typeof here as well. So as you can see, the first one is a number, whereas the second one is a string. So this is what is known as type coercion in JavaScript, and it is important for you to understand how this type coercion works, because later down the line, whenever you start working on some project or anything, you will see a lot of these things come into play. So you will have to maneuver your code around this type coercion or around this implicit type converting, so that you actually understand what is happening inside your code. Okay. Also, from this demonstration, we understand the dynamic nature of variables when it comes to JavaScript. So at first, this xyz variable was assigned as a number. Later, we converted to a string here, right? So it doesn't really matter what you initialize a variable with, whether you initialize it as a string or a number. It does not really matter. So if you want, you can later down the line change the data type of your variable by assigning it different kinds of values. Okay. So next, let's move on to if-else statements and switch statements in JavaScript. So the syntax of if-else statements and switch statements in JavaScript is exactly the same as in Java or C++. So if I want to write any if-else statements, let me just comment these things out again. So if I want to write any if-else statements here, suppose at first let me just define a variable, sample boolean, and suppose I am defining it as the value true. Okay. Now, to write an if condition, we simply have to do something like this, right? And else condition like this. So yeah, it is essentially the same. That is the exact same as your Java language. Same thing goes for the switch statements, so I will not be going into that either. So instead, what we will do is we will we will study the difference between the double equal sign and the triple equal sign, as well as exclamation equal, that is not equal, and not double equal sign when it comes to JavaScript. So normally, in case of C++ or Java, whenever we use the double equal sign, we are essentially comparing two values in a conditional statement and then executing some statement, right? So suppose I am writing something like this in JavaScript. If 10 is equal quotation 10, then like do something. Okay. Now, in this conditional statement, what do you think happens? Here, what happens is JavaScript will implicitly convert this 10 string into 10 number, and then it will compare it to this 10 number here. So this will always return the value true. So if I write something like this is the loose equality operator. This line will be printed in our console. So this happens because JavaScript is implicitly converting this 10 string into 10 number and then comparing it to the 10 here. And that is because we are using the double equal sign operator. Instead of this, if we did something like this, 10 equals string 10, then console.log, this is the strict equality operator. So in this case, this condition is not going to be executed. So if we run this, you can see that this line is not being printed. That is because whenever we use the triple equality sign operator, this 10 string is not going to be converted back into 10 number. It is going to stay exactly the way it was meant to be. That is, it is going to stay as a string. All right. So it is usually, or it is in most cases, a good practice to avoid using double equality operator and instead using the triple equality operator when it comes to JavaScript, so as to avoid any unnecessary bugs in our code. So from now on, we will assume that we will assume that this double quotation or this double equality operator does not exist, and we will only be using this triple equal operator for any kind of equality checking operations in our JavaScript code. You can of course use this double equal sign, but just remember that you might face some kind of unwanted bug in your program later down the line. Now, something similar happens in case of the not equal operator as well. So the not equal operator, when we use this specific not equal operator, we call it the loose inequality operator. And when we use the double equal sign with the exclamation sign here, we call it the strict inequality operator. So for example, let's write something like this. 10 is not equal to 10, console.log, do something. Now, what do you think happens here? Now, since this is the loose inequality operator, what happens is this 10 is going to be converted to the 10 number, and then it is going to be compared to this 10 number here. All right. So obviously, this two becomes equal then, right? And so, since this two becomes equal, this statement is not going to be executed. All right. So let's at first just delete that line, or not delete. Let's just comment those lines. And now if we execute this, you can see that this line is not being printed because since we have used the loose inequality operator here, this 10 string is getting converted to 10 number, and then it is being compared to 10. And since both of them are essentially the same, we can say that this statement is becoming false, right? And so this condition is not being executed. However, if we did something like this, 10 not equal string 10, here we can write, suppose, something different, right? Like this is the strict inequality operator. And then if we run this, you can see that this line is indeed being executed, because since this is the strict inequality operator, this 10 string is not getting converted back to the 10 number, right? And so these two are not equal, and hence we can say that this line is being executed. All right. So again, it is important for you guys to know these differences whenever you work with JavaScript, so that you can save some headache later down the line whenever you work on your project. Now we will take a look at prompts, or taking input from the users. So again, there are multiple ways you can take input from the users. One of the ways is by using the prompt function. So the prompt function is as follows. You use the prompt function and you type some message. For example, this is a sample prompt. Please enter a value. And then when we run this, you can see that our page gives us a prompt and it gives us an option to input something here, right? So if we suppose type 20 here and hit OK, then that value is getting transferred back to our JavaScript here, all right? But obviously we need to store that value somewhere, so let's write let sample input is equal to prompt, right? And suppose we will be printing that value, give me a sec, and suppose we will be printing that value by using our console again. Okay, so let's write sample input. All right, now if we refresh this page and suppose we type 25, you can see in our console we are getting that value back. Now again, notice that this 25 is in white color. So what do we understand from that? We understand that whenever the user inputs anything through the prompt command, the input is always going to be a string. So if we want to convert, or if we want to make sure that we want that number that the user has input to be of the number data type, we simply have to use the number function that we saw earlier. Okay. Okay. Now let's talk about functions in JavaScript. So let's give us some space here. Okay. Functions, and let's just comment these things. Okay. All right, so when it comes to JavaScript, there are a number of ways you can actually create or declare functions. So at first, let's look at one of those ways, which is called a function declaration, right? So let's write function declaration here, just to give us some clarity as to what we are doing. And the way we can declare functions in JavaScript is by using the function keyword. Okay, so after writing the function keyword, you will have to write down the name that you want to give to your function. So suppose I am creating a function called total fruits. So after writing down the name of your function, you will give parentheses, which will store the number of arguments that you want to pass to that function, followed by your curly braces. Okay. So suppose in this case, I am creating this function here with two parameters. Suppose my first parameter name is apples and my second parameter name is oranges. Okay. As for what this function will do, suppose I simply want to print the two values of these parameters. Okay. So basically, I will simply be printing those values. So I can simply write apples, comma, oranges. So in case you are not familiar with this, you can print multiple values using the console.log function by using a comma in between the variables. Okay, so this is way too simple. Let's try to spice things up a bit. Let's write or let's create a variable called sample message, and suppose I will be using string literals, that is template literals, to create this string. Suppose I want to write I want my dollar apples and dollar oranges right now. So essentially what this line of code will do is if, for example, I have passed the value 2 and 3, that is 2 apples and 3 oranges, then this line will essentially store I want my 2 apples and 3 oranges right now. Okay, so then what we want to do is we want to suppose return this sample message. So for that, all we have to do is we have to write return sample message. Okay, and there we go, our function has been created. Now to call this function, all we have to do is very simple. We have to create a variable, suppose let x is equal to, then we can call the function total fruits. Okay, and this inside this total fruits, we have to pass the two parameters that we have, right? So suppose in this case I will be passing 5, 6. So basically what will happen is this apples variable will store the value 5, and this oranges variable is going to store the value 6. Okay. Instead of x, let's give this the name text, and let's try to print this text variable inside our console. Okay. Now, before we run this code, let's comment out everything else that we did before, and let's go ahead and see what we get. Okay, so I want my 5 apples and 6 oranges right now, because in this case we have, as you can see, we have passed 5 and 6 as arguments to our total fruits function, right? So this is just one of the ways you can create function in JavaScript. There are other ways of creating functions as well, so let's take a look at that as well. The second method is called function expression. Okay, and in case of function expression, we don't exactly follow this syntax, but kind of similar in a way. So let's see what we can do. In case of function expression, we use the same function keyword, but in this case we do not give the function any name. We simply write the parenthesis where we can pass our parameters, followed by our curly braces. And now you might be wondering, how exactly are you supposed to call this function if it does not have any name, right? So that is actually a very good question, and the answer to that question is we use the let keyword or the const keyword or the var keyword again, and we suppose want to name this function as something. So for example, suppose I want to name this function as age, and after that what we have to do is we can do something like this. We write let age is equal to function, then we have our parenthesis, and then we have our curly braces. Now suppose we want this function to calculate our current age. So let's give this function a parameter that will take our birth year, and it will return our current age. So let's just give it the variable name as birth year, and all this function will do is it will return our current age like this. So 2020 minus birth year. Okay. So yeah, essentially we have created a function, and the name of this function is called age, which will basically calculate the current age of a person. Okay. Now, if you're wondering how you are supposed to call this function, well, that's pretty simple as well. You simply write age, and inside the parenthesis you pass the name of you pass the value of the parameter. So suppose birth year is 2000, so that is what we will be passing here, and there you go. After you do this, your function will be called. Now we are not exactly storing the value that is being returned by this function to any variable, right? So for that, let's create another variable called current age, and store the value of the current age in this variable. Okay, and now we can print this value by using our console.log command again, or console.log function again. So yeah, that's what we get. Now you might be wondering, what is the difference between function declaration and function expression? Well, the difference is that when it comes to a function declaration like this, you can actually call this function even before you have actually declared it. So in this case, you can see that I am calling this function here in this line number 283, after I have created this function, right? So instead of doing that, if I want, I can also call this function here. That is, I can call this function before it has even been declared, and JavaScript will call this function. So let's run this. Actually, let's at first clear this console. Okay, and now let's run this. As you can see, I want my 5 apples and 6 oranges right now. So this line is still being printed. Okay. Actually, you know what? Let me. I think there are some other things here that need to be commented out. Let me just comment those things out as well. Okay. Now that we have commented everything out, let's try and run this page again. Okay, so you can see that the message here, that is the message that we're trying to print here, is still being printed because this is a function declaration, right? However, when it comes to function expression, we cannot call this function before it has been created. So suppose I am trying to do something like this, that is, I am trying to call the age function before it is even created, right? So now if I try to call this function, you can see that I am getting an error that says that cannot access age before initialization. So that essentially states that since we are trying to access the function age before it has been created, we cannot actually use it, okay? And so when it comes to function expression and function declaration, that is the main difference that you need to be aware of. Okay, apart from this two, we have another function in JavaScript which has been introduced in ES6+, which is known as arrow function. So let's take a look at what arrow function does now. All right, so the concept of arrow function is very simple as well. So let's at first just comment these things out. Okay, so arrow function is basically another way of creating function expression. Just the difference is it essentially lessens the number of lines of code that we have to write to create a function. So as for example, when we want to create a function by using the arrow function method, all we have to do is something like this. So we will be doing something like age is equal to, or since we do not have the age variable declared earlier, let's create the age variable first, and then we write something like this: birth year equals to 2020 minus birth year. Okay, so let's try and understand what is happening here. Now, when we take a look at the function expression that we had created here, what did we do? We used the function keyword, but we did not give any name to the function, and we simply passed the parameter to the function, and we wrote the body of that function, right? And to actually get the ability to call this function, we used the age variable, and to call that function, we used that age variable like this, right? Now, when it comes to the arrow function, we use another variable like this as well, but in this case, we do not have to use the function keyword, okay? We use this special symbol, and since this symbol kind of matches the arrow sign, we say that we are essentially using the arrow function here, okay? And in this case, what is happening is to pass any parameter to this function, we write down the parameter here, followed by the arrow symbol, and then we write down the line of code that is going to be calculated and that is going to be returned to our variable. So basically, to call this function, all we have to do is something like this. Suppose we are creating that current age variable again, and this time we will be using the arrow function that we just created, and suppose I am passing the year of birth as 2001. Okay. Now, again, let's see what is happening here. We are calling the function called age, and we are passing it the parameter 2001. Okay. Now, what is happening when we call this function is this arrow function is being called. Now, when this arrow function is being called, the value of birth year is being given the value 2001, and this current age will basically have the value 2020 minus 2001. Okay. So basically, this necessitates our coding, or this facilitates our coding by reducing the number of lines of code that we have to write. So notice that we do not really have to use the return keyword here to actually return the value of 2020 minus birth year. It will be done implicitly. Okay, so if I try to print this value now, console.log age, or sorry, not age, current age, and if we run this program, you can see that we are getting 19. So basically, we are getting the value of our current age as we have stored that value in this current age variable. Okay. Now, what happens if we have multiple parameters or we have multiple lines of code that we need to write by using arrow function? Well, in that case, what we have to do is something like this. Suppose we have two parameters, birth year, and suppose I'm also going to pass the first name of the user. Okay, so in this case, we have to essentially use parentheses to surround our parameter list. And since this, we are assuming that we are not going to have a one-liner function like this, we will have to use curly braces. Okay. So in case of curly braces, that is, in case of having multiple lines of code inside arrow functions like this, we cannot rely on this arrow symbol to be able to return the value of this calculation here. In this case, we have to use the return keyword. Okay, so when we are using arrow functions and when we are using multiple parameters or multiple lines of code inside the arrow function, that is when we are using curly braces like this, we have to rely on the return keyword again to return the value of our birth year, okay? Or essentially to return the value of whatever it is that we want to return. So yeah, at that point in time, it essentially becomes the same as your function expression or even your actual function declaration, okay? Now, if you're wondering which you should be using, that is, which format of function creation you should be using, it actually depends on your preference, because there is really no right or wrong when it comes to using this 3 different types of function creation methods. It totally depends on which type of function creation method you are comfortable with. Okay, so let's wrap up this lecture by completing this example. So instead of returning this here, let's create a message. Okay, let message is equal to, and let's create a string literal, let's create a string by using template literal here. The current age of first name, so curly brace, first name is, then we will be using the $sign again, 2020 minus birth year. Okay, and then we will be returning this message. And if we want to actually store this message somewhere, then we will simply have to create a variable. So instead of creating a variable, let's directly print this message. And the way we can do that is inside our console.log function, we will be calling the age function. Okay, and since it takes 2 parameters, we will be passing those 2 parameters here, and when we run this, we get the current age of Anas is 19. Okay, so that is how this arrow function works. All right, so that's it for today's lecture. I know it was a bit longer than our usual lectures, but we tried to cover a number of topics here related to JavaScript. Okay, so if you have any question related to any of those topics, then let me know in our live class. I will try to answer them. Okay, so I will see you then. Take care.